Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage our TED Talk, AI, Politics, and Market Research, when the models work and when they don't.
How's everyone doing? I'm one of those new faces. I have not been here before. For probably the 5 people who know me, it is an odd and even year. I'm wearing polishable shoes, and I'm wearing a collared shirt, which is very abnormal for me, and I'll explain a little bit why. I do political gambling, or at least that's what I tell people I do. Basically what we do is we do polling, and then we sell it to news organizations, we sell it to hedge funds, and then they use it to make decisions or make news editorials. So that means when we do polling, if we get it wrong, it's very public, and then I don't get to go sit on a beach in an odd-numbered year. I think the reason why one of the folks asked me to come up here is because to basically be right every time and be public, we have to be very innovative in what we use and what we don't use, whether that be sample providers, whether it be methodology, survey design, all those different things. So what I hope to talk about a little bit, and I'll do a little story intro here, is a little bit the evolution of my industry, how we've gotten it right, how we've gotten it wrong, and then where we see the next 2 to 4 years, especially as it relates to AI. So the best way I like to explain it is the Sunday before, go back to 2020, the Sunday before the election. For most of you, probably not in the office, wearing sweatpants, all that kind of stuff. I was working with a company called DDHQ. We had about 12 people, and we were in our respective Slack channels and Discord channels, and we were on the phone with a couple of hedge funds that were paying us a lot of money. We had just gotten out of the field with about $1 million worth of sample, 100,000 interviews across the country, mixed mode, landline to sell. Live caller to cell, live caller to landline, text to web, and even a little bit of sample matched online web. Depending on the state in which you do, we do it PPI back to a voter file, and then we post-weight it afterwards. It's a whole bunch of words to say, this is the type of methodology we do. We do it rolling every night, and then we come out with a top line that says someone's going to win, get this amount in Florida, someone's going to get this in Pennsylvania, and someone's going to get this in a different state, and therefore this is who's going to win on the other end. So we go through it, and we were pretty sure, about 90% sure that Joe Biden was going to win. We go through all the numbers, pay for all the data. The person on the other end goes, yeah, if you're wrong, then I don't get to make my $3 million bonus this year. So if I don't get my $3 million bonus, then you don't get hired again. They were a big client for us, right? $1 million worth of polls, all that kind of stuff. And I said, no problem at all. We're definitely going to get this, et cetera, et cetera. Everyone knows it happens a couple of days later. It took 4 or 5 days, Joe Biden won. But that's kind of what we play around with, and that's my experience here. We do quite a bit of polling. We do it around very public events, things like that, and then we get to see the results afterwards. And I'm not the only one. There's a lot of good political pollsters out there. All of us get it a little bit wrong. The key is to have a better than 500 batting average, and when you miss small. One of the ways I like to talk about the innovation is averages, right? So my favorite stat is in 2016, for the 2016 political cycle, there was a little over 22,000 public polls released across the country. This is just free stuff, whether it's your local television station or whether it's a national news organization, whether it's a campaign, they put it out there, they give you the crosstabs, they give you the survey instrument. So one of the innovations that some of the news organizations and outlets out there is they had averages, things like Real Clear Politics, things like 538, and a few others out here. Whole bunch of numbers on the screen. The big thing to take away is if you look at 2016, you see a lot of little red squares, and then as you go to 2024, less red squares. So what that tells, what you should take away is in 2016, polling wasn't so great. But by 2024, the polling averages got a whole lot better. Not perfect, but they got better. What are some of the innovations that we saw from 16 to 24? The biggest thing is how these pollsters handled sample. Most of the polling done in the late 20th century and most of the early 2000s is random digit dialing. Again, you want to get an A in stats class survey design, that's a great way to make sure you get a cross-section of sample and that you make sure it's statistically relevant. In today's world, it's really hard to get people. What a lot of them move towards is voter file or consumer file based. In other words, if I know I need to talk to a 35-year-old female in the Miami DMA who has an income of over $100,000, I don't just call a bunch and ask them a whole bunch of questions and hope they stay on the phone. I actually know that because I have their information from a voter file or consumer file. A lot of them were doing it via phone. By the time you go out to 2020, 2024, a lot of it was panel-based, right? So we could take that voter file, we could match it against an online panel. You could get them to respond, a lot of text to web, those types of things. And so you can kind of see the innovation there. Still not perfect, but it was certainly getting better. One of the other innovations is forecasting, right? So take those averages, put them into modeled forecasts. For those of you into it, 538, The Economist, the company I work for, Decision Desk HQ, we do one. But the reason why the forecast became really big is, like I said, 22,000 public polls in 2016. 2024, there was a little less than 13,000 polls. In other words, public polling, what a lot of these people were basing off this, was going down. Talk a whole hour on why that was, but bottom line is there's less public polling to go out, so folks like myself had to use more signal. Now, some of the financial institutions, some of the more private clients, they could pay for polling supplementals, but as you can see, public polling went down. But how did the forecast get better? Because again, the way to read this one on the far left, you see a lot of red boxes. Forecasts were missing things. As you get to the right, they're starting to get better. And a perfect example why this industry is pretty cutthroat. If you look in 2016, you see the word Huffington Post. In 2016, nationally, they had 98% chance that Hillary Clinton was going to win. Obviously, that wasn't the case. The people running that forecast and that polling average, they're very good. They no longer work there, and they are no longer in the industry related to that. So that's why I always say, look, if you can do this, but we're very public about our wins and losses, and not everyone necessarily makes it. Even 538, you see 538 there in 2016, 2020, and 2024. Nate Silver left in 2020. So 538's had two different people running it since then. Debate on whether or not they're good at it or not, but just gives you an idea. It's very sports-like. If you're hitting the ball, you get to play. If you're not there. I think one of the biggest innovations we saw with forecasting is how they ranked pollsters. And it's interesting, it really changed our industry, political polling, is what your rank was. And what most people keyed on, APOR has done a lot of studies on this, what most people have keyed on is how they weight their sample, and specifically how they do the post-weight analysis. The biggest difference, or the conclusion a lot of people thought why the polls were off in 2016, is most of the sample frames did not weight or consider income or education. Why is that? Because most pollsters out there were doing RDD. It's very hard to weight back to education if you don't understand what the education rates are, specifically on a state level. It's not impossible, but when you're a 2 or 3 person shop and you've been running Stata your entire life and you do RDD, it's not something that comes easy. The other thing that came about in 2020 and 2024 is mixed mode polling. For those of you who've been around for 20 years, I remember sitting in some of my statistical classes, especially survey design. If you wanted to mix a landline and, say, a door knock or a piece of mail, really old school polling, it was sacrilege. You're going to fail your sample design class. That is all the rage today. If you're in political polling and you tell me that you don't mix mode, landline, online panel, and text to web, that I know you're probably not going to get it right. Very hard to post weight on the end, but it's what you have to do to get these things right. And that's where some of these forecasts came in. They picked up on the signal from these pollsters that would do some of the mixed mode and get a little bit better signal. A little bit about what this means going forward, right? So the story I've said is, hey, a lot of the last 10 or 15 years in politics, for those of us who have to get it right or be very publicly wrong, we played a lot in sample frames, a lot in post-weighting methodology, those types of things, a lot of massaging the data, so to speak. I mean, that's what the detractors of forecasting say. All we're doing is we're just taking less data, we're applying more math to it to get a little bit more signal. But I think really where we're going to move now is 3 different categories with AI, and this is kind of where I see it over the next 2 to 4 years. I'm going to break it down into 3 things: what scares me, where I think it'll change, and where I think it'll improve. I don't think scare should be surprising to anyone. Fraud, right? Like, that's the biggest thing. That was my big takeaway looking at all the people here. There's all these startups in the online panel detecting fraud and all that other kind of stuff. And at some point you can ask me, I have my own opinions about how much fraud is out there. But probably one of the biggest things I'm thinking about as I buy as I buy more online sample is spoofing, right? This is the biggest question we always have is what's the veracity of the panel? I tend to get at least when I buy this stuff, I tend to get a lot of pushback when I say, okay, well, can you match it against the voter file that I got yesterday? And can you give me a turnaround today about what the match rate is? Can we confirm that that person's at least on a 30-day lag or something like that? These are the types of things that political people ask for online panels. They don't always get it. And those are the types of techniques we would have used 10 years ago to root out, fraudulent panel data, or at least some of that. Now it's getting a little bit different because you can have some of these LLMs play around with the intake forms and responding to it. This image was taken off by one of the folks who works for me on Twitter. This is nothing against Qualtrics on here, but it is interesting from an intake form. We played around with this with some of the other, I'm sure the panel we played around with is in here to see if we could get it to answer some of these intake questions. But I think we're going to see a whole lot of flood on that. So I'm very encouraged to see that there's a lot of fraud detection technology out there, because from a political perspective, if we're going to use the online panels and what we do, we're going to need to see a whole lot more of that. Otherwise, we're going to continue to use phones and text to web for a lot. Survey design. This one I think we're going to see immediately. I was talking to someone earlier. ChatGPT, just the free version, does better than your average person straight out of a PhD program with a survey design class, at least writing first drafts. I would never let it write final drafts, but at least first drafts. It's very good. And so in a lot of ways, that's already made its way into a lot of survey shops, especially in these political shops that are 3, 4, 5-man operations that do $2 to $3 million of revenue a year. This is super helpful to them because they can take off $250,000 of salary because they can use ChatGPT to build out their surveys. What I think you're seeing a lot of these companies do now, some of the bigger ones, like the public opinion strategies, et cetera, they've got 30 years worth of surveys. They're actually in pretty good format. They've heard of this thing called an MCP, which is basically a private version of ChatGPT. They can put all their surveys in there and they can start doing some real analysis about, hey, did we answer that? Did we ask that right track, wrong track question the same over the last 20 years? Can we go back and do longitudinal surveys, things like that? So I think that's one of the innovations now. The next one, the one that I'm pretty interested in is, because I always look for, how do I get more response rates? And again, I think where a lot of people are going to push the envelope is specifically written non-biased surveys that are more reactive to different cohorts. In other words, what I mean is, if I write a question about what someone thinks about the economy and I tweak it a little bit to be more responsive to an 18 to 25-year-old and I write it differently to a 45 plus person, I will get a higher response rate. Now, immediately, if I were in survey design class, I get failed because they say, hey, you can't ask the same question differently to each person in the cohort. You're not going to have representativeness. I would disagree. You got to be very careful about how you write it. But if I can get an extra half point of response rate inside the 18 to 25 because I write the question a little bit more accessible to them and I can maintain my longitudinal fidelity, I'm going to do it all day long. Now, this is the cutting edge. I'm sure there's someone in here who thinks I'm full of it, but there's going to be papers, there's going to be a couple minted PhDs off of this, because I already know people are playing around with this, and it's only possible because of AI, because we're going to need that to deliver these surveys and then write some of these questions out. The final one, and this one is relatively pie in the sky. This is a pretty interesting link. Again, I don't have a good representation over this. There's a paper written in March of 2023 by a gentleman named Steve Anselberry. For those of you who read the Harvard CCES survey that comes out every year, it's a huge longitudinal survey, him and a couple of people. What they did is they took an LLM, they fed it with a whole bunch of news content. They also fed it with 10,000 responses from a panel, and they asked it to predict political outcomes in 2022. And it got it pretty well. Didn't get it everything right. Wasn't better than the best pollster out there, but it was pretty close. And again, this was just basically 3 grad students and a professor who had an interesting idea and knew that they were going to write a paper that was going to get one of them tenure, which is a nice way of me saying is they were trying, but they were not trying that hard. And they got pretty close. The fascinating thing about this for me is, again, they didn't have a whole lot of money and they were playing around with this and they got it pretty close. This is one of those things where with a 100,000 person panel, you feed it into an LLM with news every single day, and you can ask it political tracking questions. It might basically cost 80% of what the cost per complete would be. And so therefore you can sell some of these answers out there and get some of them out a whole lot faster. Again, that'll probably scare half the people, more than half the people in this room. But considering that most of the buyers out there, they're willing to spend something a little bit cheaper if they can get 80% of the answer at 10% of the cost, especially in my world where they're going to do message testing and things like that. This is the kind of thing that will really change it going forward, and it's accessible. This is the kind of thing I think we're going to see people play around with quite a bit more going forward. And just to kind of close this out, this by no means is a comprehensive timeline, but I just want to show a little bit of perspective. You see here we have 1936, Elmer Roper, George Gallup, first poll used in political context. 538 Harris Online poll, late 90s, early 2000s. What I'll call the methodology renaissance, what I talked about with how we play around with sample frames, mixed modes, those types of things. Where I think see this going in the next 4 years, the survey design stuff I was talking about, you're going to see some of the bigger pollsters in the Republican and Democratic side do that, use these techniques privately in 2026. And I think some of these LLM, whether it's on the low end, fixing missing data, all the way up to actually replacing respondents or emulating respondents, I think you're going to see that into 2028. And why do I think it's that quickly? It's because, again, in my industry, we can't just do RDD for 40 years because that's what worked. We have to innovate because there's always someone else. And the electorate, the people we're polling is very different. They change. It's the last anecdote I'll tell you is when I got started in this industry in 2008, we were doing IVR, right, interactive voice robocalls, which again, dirty word in a lot of this room. We were getting 6% response rates. We could get a 10-question complete for less than $2, and we were hitting, within 2 points of final numbers. You can't do that today, not even close. Put aside the legalities of it, but the electorate over the course of 10 years is not responding to that. The people doing text to the web, they're going to experience that kind of phenomenon over the next 10 years. I think that's why a lot of this room, especially the online panel space, is innovating, because obviously there's issues with fraud and accuracy, and if you get that better, we'll use. But this industry, or at least the political polling industry, always has to stay ahead of it because the respondents are always changing. And if they're changing, then we need to change with them. Otherwise, we're going to get it wrong, and then we're going to be out of a job. That's all I got. Hopefully it gives you an idea of kind of how some political pollsters thinking about AI in the future.